So today we're going to talk about one of the premier American writers of science fiction in the 20th century, Ray Bradbury. Though only a very small percentage of his work really fits the definition of what purists would call science fiction. Many of his works, for example, Something Wicked This Way Comes, which we'll be looking at today, really fall more easily into the realm of what we would call dark fantasy. And indeed, there's also some work in which there is sort of very little supernatural machinery at all. But so what we're going to be looking at in Something Wicked This Way Comes is the ways in which various symbols of childhood innocence, right? The idyllic American small town, the traveling carnival show, are sort of used here in the service of creating a kind of terror that is born out of regret, out of thinking about the paths not chosen, the paths you could have chosen. So let's start by talking a little bit about the history of the genesis of this particular novel. So when Bradbury was a teenager in 1932, he went to a carnival and saw a magician who called himself Mr. Electrico. Right, that name makes itself into the novel as Mr. Cougar's new alter ego after he is artificially aged on the Carousel. But this Mr. Electrico was a stage magician who accomplished various feats with an electrical wand, right, which he waved at the young Bradbury, said, "Live forever," and made his hair stand on end. So this episode gets reversed in Something Wicked This Way Comes. Instead, Mr. Electrico curses Jim and Will to short lives. But it's in this moment, this moment sticks with Bradbury as he becomes a professional writer, and the idea of a horror story based on a carnival act never really quite leaves him. So we see the idea for a carnival-themed horror novel in his notes appearing as early as 1945. His first published collection of short stories was called Dark Carnival. It was published in 1947. But there is no story in that collection that actually refers to a carnival. Nonetheless, there is plenty of notebook evidence, manuscript evidence that this was something he was already mulling. By 1948, he publishes a story in Weird Tales called The Black Ferris. Now, The Black Ferris is the tale of a carny who has a magical Ferris wheel that he can ride to age himself backwards and forwards, depending on which direction it's going. And he sort of will then run around terrorizing the towns he visits. And it's from this germ of an idea, from this story, that Bradbury draws much of what would become Something Wicked This Way, the central conceit of the carousel that ages you forwards and backwards. So he works on drafts of the novel throughout the 1950s, while also writing screenplays for film and for television, and produces a novel and illustrations that's never published with the artist Joe Mugnani in 1952. Right? So a sort of graphic novel with no words, based on this concept. Now, the novel drafts that we have from the 1950s combine elements of The Black Ferris with teleplays that Bradbury wrote in the 1950s. The Merry-Go-Round, which has a very similar sort of central conceit to The Black Ferris, and The Marked Bullet, which is based around the bullet trick that Charles Holloway uses to kill the Dust Witch in the novel. The first portion of the finished novel to appear in print was excerpted as Nightmare Carousel in Mademoiselle in the US in January 1962 and in Argosy in the United Kingdom in October 1962. And the novel was published in the US just in time for Halloween in September 1962. Now, Bradbury already had a long history with the world of pulp publishing. His first published story appeared in a pulp magazine called Imagination, yes, with an exclamation point, in 1938. And he himself, in the late 1930s, published a fanzine called Futuria Fantasia that published original fiction. Among the outlets he published in was Weird Tales, and through working with Weird Tales, he managed to forge a connection with Lovecraft's protege and literary executor, August Derleth. And indeed, Dark Carnival, Ray Bradbury's first published book, was initially put out by Arkham House, Derleth's small specialty publisher that was intended primarily to keep alive the works of H.P. Lovecraft and other Weird Tales writers. So a central concept to understand as we read this novel is the idea of the carnivalesque. And here we have a painting of a medieval carnival. Right, now this is a theoretical construct articulated by the Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin in his book Rabelais and His World, first published in 1941. And the carnivalesque refers to a situation in which the normal social order or hierarchy is temporarily suspended. So an example would be the medieval Feast of Fools, right, where the king is deposed for a day and a fool is crowned in his place. Mardi Gras would be an example of a carnivalesque sort of event, or what is often called carnival in Europe and in South America. Right? It's the same, basically the same thing, right? These sort of riotous public occasions when the normal order of things is reversed temporarily. Now, Bakhtin assigns 4 primary elements to the carnivalesque. Right? The first is free interaction between social classes. Right? Social distinctions cease to exist in the carnivalesque. The king can, dance a jig with a beggar. Members of rival guilds can freely associate with each other. Right? People who wouldn't normally interact are free to do so at Carnival. There is also tolerance for eccentric behavior, for excessive behavior. Right? People can drink and eat to excess. People can wear bizarre costumes. People can, within certain limits, behave lewdly in public, right? Sorts of things that would get them labeled as mad or dangerous. Behaviors that would get them labeled mad or dangerous on a normal day, on Carnival Day, is tolerated. Right? Free license to do pretty much whatever you want. The third, misalliance. This sort of builds on the free interaction idea, right? Not only are different social classes free to interact with one another, they are also free to make alliances with one another against other groups, other social classes. So you may have, rival guilds coming to say the carpenters and the shipwrights coming together against, the bookmakers and the printers. You may have, people dressed as angels and people dressed as devils partying together. And finally, sacrilege and blasphemy go unpunished on Carnival Day. On Carnival Day, you can take the name of the Lord in vain, the priest can't do anything to you about it. You can make blasphemous jokes, church can't touch you. Right? For one day a year, you are basically free to thumb your nose, give the middle finger, or wave your bare ass at authority. All forms of authority. Before things then return to normal. But Cougar and Dark's Pandemonium Shadow Show doesn't quite work like a carnival. Instead, it's a sort of anti-carnival, right? It represents in some ways those forces of repressive authority that keep everyone in their particular social place. We note, for example, that when the train is coming through to Greentown, the organ, which plays by itself, is playing church music. When the boys first meet Mr. Dark, the illustrated man, Bradbury focuses our attention on Mr. Dark's suit, right? It was the suit which fascinated Will, for it seemed woven of boar bramble, clock spring hair, bristle, and a sort of ever-trembling, ever-glistening dark hemp. The suit caught light and stirred like a bed of black tweed thorns, interminably itching. So what Mr. Dark's suit resembles is a hair shirt that would be worn by a medieval monk, a medieval ascetic, right? For the mortification of the flesh, right? You wear something that is going to make you continually uncomfortable to remind you of human sinfulness and to stop you from seeking out luxury. Mr. Dark loomed closer, magnificent in his picture gallery flesh, his eyes, the eyes of all his beasts and hapless creatures cutting through his shirt, coat, trousers, fastening the old man tight, biting him with fire, fixing him with thousandfold attentions. So Mr. Dark has the images of all those he controls, all those in his kingdom, as it were, right, inked onto his body. In a lot of ways, what it's similar to, it reminds me of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with a 17th century book of political philosophy by Thomas Hobbes. It's called Leviathan. And the Leviathan for Hobbes is essentially like the bodies of all the subjects of the kingdom come together in the person of the king, right? The king as the physical embodiment of the will of all of his subjects. And there's an image of that on the sort of the frontispiece of the book of, a sort of crowned giant whose body is made up of thousands of other people. Now, the other thing to note about the Shadow Show as anti-carnival is the way its members respond to laughter, right? Laughter is that sort of that thing, that which mocks, that which overturns seriousness, which overturns authority, and they can't abide it, they can't stand it, right? When the Dust Witch tries to kill Charles Halloway, right? Chased, bruised, beaten by his laugh, which echoed, rang, swam to fill the marble vaults. She whirled at last, claws razoring the wild air, and fled to fall downstairs, right? They can't abide being mocked. They can't abide not being taken seriously. And a carnival is supposed to be fun, right? A carnival isn't supposed to be serious. Now we see various examples of the uncanny in the Shadow Show as well. When Mr. Cougar ages himself backwards to take the place of the boy Robert, Will and Jim watch the process from a distance, right? For there was the pink, shiny Halloween mask of a small, pretty boy's face, but almost as if holes were cut out where the eyes of Mr. Cougar shone out. Old, old eyes, as bright as sharp blue stars, and the light from those stars taking 1,000,000 years to get there. And through the little nostrils cut in the shiny wax mask, Mr. Cougar's breath went in, steam came out ice. And the Valentine candy tongue moved small behind those trim white candy kernel teeth. So underneath this artificial mask, this false face, the boys still recognize the eyes of Mr. Cougar, right? They see the familiar eyes of Cougar in the unfamiliar face, the unfamiliar body of this boy he's turned himself into. Robert's aunt, Miss Foley, experiences a similar they experience a similar sensation when they come upon her, having been transformed by the carnival, right? But now in the doorway, in the cold rain, there was time to think of Miss Foley afraid of mirror mazes, Miss Foley alone not so long ago at the carnival, and maybe screaming they did what they finally did to her. Around and around, around and around, too many years, more years than she had ever dreamed of shucked away, right? They find a small girl whom they recognize as Miss Foley. The dwarf in the sideshow is the lightning rod salesman from the beginning of the novel transformed. Right? For the dwarf is looking down, and in his eyes were the lost bits and fitful pieces of a man named Fury, who had sold lightning rods how many years ago in the long, the easy, the safe and wondrous time before this fright was born. So one of the things that's so terrifying about the carnival's powers is that they are able to take people the boys know, people the boys are familiar with, and transform them into something else, something different, something alien. Now, this is one of the powers of what Mr. Holloway calls the autumn people, right? He uses this label to describe Cougar, Dark, and the other denizens of the carnival. For some, autumn comes early, stays late through life, where October follows September and November touches October, and then instead of December and Christ's birth, there is no Bethlehem star, no rejoicing, but September comes again, and old October, and so on down the years, with no winter, spring, or revivifying summer. For these beings, fall is the ever-normal season, the only weather, there be no choice beyond. Where do they come from? The dust. Where do they go? The grave. Does blood stir in their veins? No, the night wind. What ticks in their head? The worm. What speaks from their mouth? The toad. What sees from their eye? The snake. What hears with their ear? The abyss between the stars. They sift the human storm for souls, eat flesh of reason, fill tombs with sinners. They frenzy forth. In gusts they beetle scurry, creep, thread, filter, motion, make all moons sullen, and surely cloud all clear-run waters. The spider web hears them, trembles, breaks. Such are the autumn people. Beware of them. So the autumn people are the people of death, of decay, of madness, of sin, of evil, right? Of decadence, of a falling off from a state of innocence and purity. Right? These are people who, as Charles Holloway describes them, have never been innocent, will never be innocent. Their sole pleasure is bringing other people into their menagerie of horrors. Now, the two major symbolic structures in the carnival itself are the Maze of Mirrors and the Dark Carousel. So let's start with the Maze of Mirrors and the disorienting effect that has on the people who go into it. We'll start with Miss Foley, the boy's teacher, who when she goes into the Maze of Mirrors sees a girl she thinks she knows, right? Gone? She's at the bottom. Poor girl, I knew her. I know you, I said when I first saw her a minute ago. I waved, she waved. Hello, I ran, bang, I fell. She fell. A dozen, 1,000 of her fell. Wait, I said. Oh, she looked so fine, so lovely, so young. But it scared me. What are you doing here, I said. Why, I think she said, I'm real. You're not. She laughed way underwater. She ran off in the maze. So what Miss Foley has had an encounter with here in the Maze of Mirrors is her past self, right? The aging single teacher sees herself again as a young, attractive woman who runs off back into the maze to entice Miss Foley to try to become this young, promising girl again, right? To go back and live out a different path. Now, the image that's presented to Charles Holloway when he enters the maze is rather different. And between himself and Jim in need of rescue stood an army of 1 million sick-mouthed, frost-haired, white time-bearded men. They were so old, so very old, and got much older the farther away they marched, wildly gesticulating as Dad threw up his hands to fend off the revelation. This wild image repeated to insanity. Now, what this is playing on is Charles Holloway's particular neuroses. He's an older man married to a younger wife with a preteen son. And he is constantly fretting over his old age and weak heart. Dark has offered him at another point the chance to wind back some of those years and become young again, right? So what's being dangled in his face is the terror of old age, right? This is what you are. You are an old, old man. You are weak. You are stumbling. You can't save that boy. But if you could wind those years back and be young again. So the Maze of Mirrors, by presenting people with either an idealized self-image or with a picture of their own fears and neuroses, Cougar and Dark can use this device to get people onto the carousel for their transformation into the sideshow freaks. Now, as for the carousel itself, right? We all know by now how the carousel works, right? It only operates at night. The out of order sign is always up during the day. And you ride the carousel forward in order to age. You ride it backward in order to wipe the years away. And it plays the funeral march. If you go forwards, it plays the funeral march backwards if you go backwards. So, when they're watching Cougar on the carousel, right? Another time around under the sky, and trees and Will whispering, Jim counting the times around, while the night air warmed to summer heat by friction of sun-metal brass, the passionate back-turned flight of beasts wore the wax doll down and washed him clean with stranger musics until all ceased. The small shape stepped down from the silent world, its face in shadow, but its hands, newborn wrinkled pink, held out in raw carnival lamplight. Right? There's something really horrific and creepy about the way Bradbury describes Cougar as like a wax doll being melted down. It comes out with these newborn pink hands. And then as Jim is riding the carousel near the end, right? Jim, who desperately wants to be older, to grow up and leave his provincial small town, as opposed to Will, who wants to slow down, hold back, and remain a boy a bit longer. Right. Jim awoke. Circle half round, his face now July, now December. He sees the pole, bleeding out his despair. He wanted, he did not want. He wished, he rejected, he ardently wished again, in flight, in heat spell river of wind and blaze of metal, in jog of July and August horses, whose hoofs thudded in the air like thrown fruit, his eyes blazed. So we have here Jim's indecision as he rides the carousel, right? He wants to be older, but he also understands the price that all of these other people who've ridden the carousel have paid. And so it's only when his friend physically comes to restrain him, to pull him back, that he's able to get off. Now, just to review here the basic principles of the carnivalesque against the carnival of darkness, of death, of seriousness. Right? First, again, laughter used as a weapon against the Dust Witch. Laughter used as a weapon against all of the carnival freaks. Not only does Charles Halloway use it to drive the Dust Witch away in the library, he also uses it to kill her in the bullet trick, right? By etching a smile onto the bullet. Love is used as a weapon against GM Dark when he transforms himself into the boy Jed, and Charles Halloway insists on giving him fatherly love. That fatherly love kills him. He can't take being loved. And finally, the way Charles and Will use singing and dancing as medicine to bring Jim back to his senses. All right, so that's all we have for Bradbury. We're going to be looking at a novel next time that has no real supernatural machinery in it, but I think is still a really good contemporary example of the weird. It's Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And I want you to think about the following. First, look at the relationship the Blackwood family and the other rich families in the town have with the villagers, and consider how this relationship changes after the fire. Also, right, the novel is mostly concerned with two sisters, Constance and Maricat Blackwood, who are survivors of a disaster that claimed most of the members of their family. What really happened to the rest of the family, and how do we find out? You will also see that Maricat, the younger sister, practices a kind of sympathetic magic. How do her spells work? Do they work? Why does she cast them? And finally, why do you think Maricat is always reminding herself to be kinder to Uncle Julian? Does it have anything to do with a set of rules that she has made up for herself? All right, so that's all we have for today. Shirley Jackson next time. See you then.